Hey everyone, welcome to our most recent class and my kitchen again for the fifth time. This is class number 5 and no piano playing, at least currently. There may be some later. I've got a haircut. Does it look good? My cousin cut it. She's a hairstylist. She said, I want to cut your pandemic hair, so she did it. So that's what's new with me. Hope you're doing something fun and new and stuff like that. So let's get started. There's a lot to get through. I want to start with the overall of the big picture here. Last class and this class, we're talking about practical considerations. Earlier, we were talking much more theoretical about things, and now we're talking about lots of practical things. In particular, this class, we're going to be talking about CAL, computer-assisted language learning, interaction, and classroom management. And then we only have basically 2 more units where we're going to be doing reading during weeks 6 and 7. And week 8, the final week of our course, we're not going to have reading. So we'll be concentrating mostly on getting those final projects. So that's just to give you an insight of where we're at and where it fits in with everything else. So to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about CAL. And I should say that CAL is my expertise area, computer-assisted language learning. It's something I got involved with very early and something I enjoy quite a bit. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is pause your video and read through these 5 different scenarios and tell me which one of these are examples of CAL. So go ahead and pause, and when you're done thinking through that, we'll come back to the next slide. Okay, so each of these actually is an example of CAL. Each of them was kind of a trick question. They're all CAL. And how do we define CAL? Well, Egbert says that most simply it means using chip-based technology to support language teaching and learning in some way. That's a very broad definition, but it's what fits under there. This definition applies to all languages, all skill areas, and all content. So anything in which you're including chip-based technology, now we're talking about CAL. One of the things about working in a professional field like language teaching is you get all kinds of acronyms like EFL, ESL, like so all these things we've been talking about, CLT, CLL. I mean, there's just tons of them. And there's no different with CAL. In fact, CAL has a lot of different names. Phil Hubbard talks about how sometimes it's called CAL or CEL or TEL. Technology enhanced language learning, and you can go down this list, and it doesn't really matter. They're all essentially looking at the same thing. How do we use computers and computer technology, chip-based technology, in our teaching to enhance that? So I still call it CAL. Some people like to choose a new name. I'm not much for changing names if it's not needed. So I still consider myself a CAL teacher. So one thing I do want to share with you guys is as you start thinking about becoming a language teacher is that I think it's really important to develop areas of expertise, or what we might call a niche. For me, I was really lucky early on I started as a young kid playing a lot of video games and getting a computer when I was pretty young and playing around with that. So I've always felt comfortable using computers and incorporating them, and it's become very much my niche. So developing a niche area within your language teaching, instead of just, it distinguishes you from other people. And it doesn't have to be, there's all kinds of different niches. And in fact, when we talk about professional development in one of the later talks of this class, the later chapters of this class, we'll look at, opportunities you have for developing, a specialty area within CAL. And in fact, if you're thinking about those podcasts we just did, or we looked at, there's a lot of people that have specialty areas and they're talking about them. So for example, TESOL intersections, there's lots of different ones, like of where you can develop your niche, such as the non-native English speaking teachers, which I think is relevant to that, what we're talking about, English as a lingua franca. Do you need to be a native speaker? Adult education is the other one, but there's a whole list of a ton of them. And so it's really good to become familiar with those. CAL tools for students. So I'm going to ask you again to pause and think a little bit about this before we go on, just to kind of reflect on your own experiences. Have you experienced CAL in your language learning experiences, either learning on your own or learning directed by a teacher? And also, have you had any bad call experiences where maybe a teacher or a program just didn't really work very well? So go ahead and pause and think about this. And when you come back on, we'll continue. Okay, I'm assuming you're back now. When I do this as a live class, we've looked at a collaborative doc and we've listed it up there. I'm not going to do that now, but I just do think that it helps you to connect some of what we're talking about here, because I want to hopefully give you a bit more of a principle to using call as a teacher when you're thinking about being on the teacher side. So here's an interesting question. Does being good with technology, does that mean that you're going to be good at teaching with technology automatically? So the question to that is, I think, a profound no, although I would say that if you are good with technology, the chances are you have a lot better at being good at teaching with technology simply because you're comfortable with it. But just because you know a lot of technology doesn't make you a good language teacher who uses call. So for some of the things you have to think about besides just being good with the technology are, who are your students? What is your context? What are your goals of that particular lesson? And how do you integrate it smoothly within that lesson? So it's not just about, oh, I know this tool and I'm good at it, so it's going to be easy to be a call teacher. There's more to it than that. TESOL has some what they're called tech standards, which they feel that all professional teachers, language teachers now that are becoming classroom-based teachers should be good at certain things. So these are very interesting tech standards. You should know how to do this. You should be able to do that. So basically, it's kind of like a can-do statements. What are you able to do? And they have these certain expectations that if you're going to be a 21st century teacher, you know how to do certain things. It's worth taking a look at. I'll drop those in the links for this particular, if you want to look at them. They're free, and it's great that they share them, and they're really interesting. One thing I developed in an article I wrote was talking about how do teachers keep pace with technology, because it's so challenging and so difficult. There's so many things out there. So sometimes I think, for example, people that are not necessarily good with technology to begin with, they kind of feel overwhelmed, like there's this vast sea of technology and what do I use and how do I use it as a teacher. But one of the things I suggest is that you build these islands of competence. So for example, maybe you start with digital audio, or you start with word processing, because probably everybody knows a little bit about word processing. You start to incorporate some of those things into the class. And so you build these little islands of competence, and you start using them, and then you use them a couple of times, and you get good at using them with your students. And from there you build out, and you build those islands to be bigger. You add new islands, and pretty soon what you're doing is you're growing some larger, maybe even continents that you're growing, and it's really hard to become good at everything, and especially overwhelming if you're trying to become good at everything at once. So don't try that, is my recommendation. Instead, build small islands of competence. Take it one step at a time. There's something also that I've talked about called SMART Call. And a number of people have talked about this, so it's not just my idea, but it's an approach to integrating technology into your language classroom. And so sometimes we think about technology tools, students' abilities, needs, interests, the context, and the lesson and goals. So all of those things are things we need to juggle. So what should drive the teacher's choices for using a particular technology tool? So we're going to take a look at what beginning teachers typically do. And this is what's called a tool-driven approach. And so a beginning teacher will sometimes talk about, I just found this very cool new tool. Wow, look at this new app that I found. It's great. I really loved using it, and now I'm going to find a way to get my students to use it, and they'll love it too. So I found this tool, and now I'm going to look for a way to use it in my class. So that means the tool is driving what you're doing. And sometimes we might be able to say that that's putting the cart before the horse. That's a metaphor we use, and it just basically means you're getting kind of ahead of yourselves. And so that is probably not the recommended way to do it, even though a lot of teachers, especially novice teachers, tend to do that. So that's putting that cart before the horse, not the house. A call-driven approach is the one that a lot of call teachers and call experts advocate more for. And what does that look like? So that's going from your lesson and your goals to your tools. So, for example, in my listening class, we're doing a unit on love. I need a nice audio that talks about love and the different way people look at love in the U.S. culture, or something like that. And then I start doing some research and I find some audio things online that have some podcasts or some audio transcripts that I could use with my class. I find that there's VOA, there's NPR, there's TED Ed, there's Randall's. All of these might have something on love, and I say, oh, those might be good options. But then what I do is I decide, look at those options and I decide which one is the best for my class based on the needs, based on the level, based on what I'm trying to do with it. And that puts the horse before the cart. So what are my goals? And then I look for the right tool that's going to help me meet my goals. So that's called a different approach to a goal-driven approach to expressing a call way to about doing things. There's this last thing. I'm going to put this also in the links below. That's these comprehensive call sites that are out there. There's a whole number of them, and you might use these for one of the next upcoming projects is to do a textbook analysis, but you're also welcome to look at some comprehensive call sites and use those for your analysis as well. So let's move away from call. The other topic this week is interactive classrooms. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and look at these questions and think about them on your own for a minute or two, pause the video, and then come back. We won't go over them, but I do think it helps you to think through some of the things. And we will have some of these questions in the discussion this week. I'm going to load up some of these questions about call, the interactive classroom, and things like that. So go ahead and pause and then come back. Okay, so hopefully you're back now. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about here is an interesting graphic that I think about when the teacher is up in front of the class and the teacher does all the talking. This kind of shows what a class looks like. A portion of that class is actively disengaged. They could care less about what's going on. Some of them are passively disengaged. They're looking at you, but you're not really following what's going on. Some of them are trying to listen and keep up, but they're only getting some percentage of what you're saying. Some of them are listening, but they're too scared to ask for any questions if they're confused. A few of them are confident, calm, and they're keeping up with you. They're right in that zone. And then maybe there's some that already know what you're talking about, and so maybe they're bored. So it's funny because you're looking for that prime zone, and that's really hard if it's just you talking the whole time as the teacher. You don't get a lot of sense of getting students that are engaged with you. So what can we do to increase engagement? Well, there's a lot of different things that the chapter talks about. But one of the things that is really good, I think, to think about is the proxemics, the physical layout of a classroom. And a lot of times that's overlooked. But here's an example of a room that has been formed into a round circle. And when I was doing my internship as a language teacher, this is the way we were taught to build our classes. Were typically around 15 students, maybe up to 20, and we were always putting our students in circles. It was a speaking class. And so it made a lot of sense to form circles and things like that. But if you look over on the left, there's different styles of seating arrangements that you can find in many different classrooms. And each of them kind of develop a different type of atmosphere that you're developing in the classroom. And they will shape or change what you're trying to do. So that's kind of interesting. So here's some discussion questions. Go ahead and pause and think about them. And again, we'll probably do more talking about this in the discussions this week. So take a minute, look at these, think through them, and then come back. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do what I call a class drop-in, or actually we're not going to do this. This is going to be your task for this week. Is we're going to do a class drop-in. You're going to see a particular class, and there's some questions to follow up after you do that. That will be in the class drop-in, which will be our task for this particular part of the week. And so those are the questions there. But we're going to continue on talking about things. I'm also going to do a what not to do. This is a scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, a very old movie back from when I was in high school. And it's just a great scene of what not to do to create interaction in the classroom. So I'll also have that link posted so you can check that out. One of the things that we can talk about, if you're thinking about that video, it shows you what not to do, and that's because this guy is asking a lot of what we call display questions. So there's different ways to categorize questions, but display versus referential is one way. Display questions are sometimes called what's in my pocket questions. It's because we already know the answer. The person who's asking the question already knows the answer. And they're very atypical in real life. Most of the time, we're not asked questions that the questioner already knows the answer to. That's pretty rare. Referential questions are questions where the asker does not know what the answer is going to say. So a quick example of that. Let's say I'm teaching a class and we're looking at colors, and we're working on colors, and I ask my students to look around the room. What color is the wall? Good. Okay. What color is my book? Yeah. What color is John's shirt? Good. And what color are my eyes? I don't know. So you could go, and so these are things that, everybody knows, if we can see the answer, etc. So those would be display questions or what's in my pocket questions, because we already know. Referential questions, on the other hand, would be things that we don't know. So if I ask we're doing colors, and I ask, say, what's your favorite color and why? Now that's suddenly a question I won't know what the students are going to ask, so I'm going to get a very different response in that case. So display versus referential is one way to look at questions. That doesn't mean you should never do display questions. In fact, with beginning classes, I tend to use a number of display questions because we're working on vocabulary, and it's more about seeing whether they understand the vocabulary and they're able to apply them and produce it. But especially as you move along, you have to mix in referential questions, and as their increase, I think, in their abilities, referential questions become much more common, and they're more typical of what we do in real language. There's some other ways to, Kate Kinsella, who I worked with for a while at San Francisco State University as a grad student, she classifies different types of teacher questions, and these are interesting to know, but we won't go over them because of time. Let's think a little bit about, when we think about classroom design and how that layout, this is another thing to think about. Teacher talk versus student talk, and how much time are we doing for each? So, if it's a language class, what are your goals? Your goals are probably to get your students talking and engaged, because that's usually a sign of engagement, but also to using the language, right? So in a classroom where it's the teacher doing all the talking, and let's say I'm asking each student a question and the student responds. I ask another student a question, the student responds. I ask another student a question, and the student responds. So maybe I'm still trying to make, it's a lot of teacher talk, but I'm trying to make it interactive, but still you're not going to get a lot of opportunities for students to be speaking. Most of the students are going to be quiet and listening to other people most of the time. So what design strategies can teachers take to reduce that? So go ahead and think about that, pause again, and then when you're done, we'll look at the next slide and we will actually see some answers to that right now. Okay, so some of the things that you can do in getting more student talk and less teacher talk is to get the students talking with each other more. So there's some quick ways to do that. Pair work, group work, or something called think, pair, share, which kind of summarizes a lot of ways that people do and use in communicative language teaching, CLT. So think, pair, share basically means, let's say I put a big question out there for my students. I say, take a minute to think about this on your own and jot down a few ideas on paper or something like that. Then when they're done with that, I say, okay, now go to a partner and pair up with a partner and tell each other what you were thinking about for that question. And then the final thing, the sharing, is now I'm going to ask some of the different groups to report back to the entire class. You get a lot more student talk in this case, but not only that, for shyer students who often don't want to make mistakes or they need time to think about the language because they're not so super fluent in the language, this can be very valuable, because then what they can do is they can have time to actually strategize about what they're going to say instead of being afraid that they're going to say it wrong. Another thing we can do is in class design for more engagement and is what's called project-based learning. So project-based learning is basically a teaching method where students learn by creating real-world types of projects. And ideally they're personally meaningful, and you can get students ideally that are building skills or using skills that they already have in building a project. So for example, building a website or creating a poster or putting on a play. These could all be examples of project-based learning. There's one example that I have here from PBL Works, which is a really nice site that talks about different types of project-based learning. Just a quick note, sometimes people refer to PBL as problem-based learning, which is spin-off thing. But one way I often look at it is project-based learning, which is slightly different than problem-based learning. Anyway, PBL works, or project-based learning. In this case, they have an example of a poetry project in which they have grades 9 through 12 working on that. So it's a nice example of how project-based learning will work. Let's go on to this last topic, or this next topic, pair work and group work. So there are advantages, but there are also disadvantages to pair and group work. So not everybody likes it. Not all students enjoy working in pairs, working in groups. Some people like a more traditional classroom where the teacher does all the talking and it's more competitive. But most students tend to, in my observations, they tend to do better, particularly in a language class where there is more pair and group work. But still, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. It's not a panacea. It's not a perfect solution for all situations. So take another minute and pause and think through what are some of the advantages, what are some of the disadvantages of pair and group work, and we'll look at some answers when you come back. Okay, here we go again. So some of the advantages of pair work: more student talk, less teacher talk. Students are often engaged better with the material. They often retain the information better when they've been engaged with the material as well. And not only that, but it also helps create a more friendly and cooperative classroom environment. So it tends to lower the affective filter, the anxiety that the students are having. Disadvantages: well, it takes more time to get through the same amount of material. If I just tell my students and I talk at them, I can get through it much more quickly. But they're less engaged. So that's, the trade-off. Sometimes groups don't always get along. They might have conflict issues, or some students do more work than others. The workload might not be distributed evenly. It can also be a little bit more challenging to get grades. When we talk about assessment next time, we'll talk about some ways of assessing, for example, these more alternative ways like projects and group work and things like that, because those are a little trickier. It doesn't fall into our old way of evaluating by giving A's and B's and C's and D's on certain things. So we'll look at some alternative ways of assessment. And it's not always valued by administrators. I've had people come in and say, is that really a language class? The students are doing all the talking. You're supposed to be the sage on the stage, the one with all the information at the front. But and sometimes even I've had students who it violates their expectations. They want the teacher to do all the talking and be the expert. So sometimes it takes a little bit of training, and so then students, and even still, sometimes students aren't happy with that environment. So it's just one of those trade-off things. This last thing we're going to talk a little bit about is developing a teaching persona, and this comes with this idea of imposter syndrome. I know when I first started teaching, I felt like, who am I to get up in front of the classroom and teach? It doesn't feel like me, and I had to really felt like I was imposter, and that other people would find me out, and that I wasn't really meant to be the teacher up at the front. But sometimes I think of this as like adulting 101. It's learning. You have to learn to take on new roles in life. And a quick example of that, my 18-year-old who just graduated from high school, he asked today if he could have a barbecue with his friends from the rowing team. And so he's is going off just a few minutes ago before I started this, and was going to go shopping, and was asking, how do I go shopping and what do I ask for? And he even called me right before I started this and asked me a question. What kind of this do I want for the what I'm making? So it's kind of interesting that he's learning to take on these new roles, and it's part of growing and becoming new. So it's exciting, but it can feel a little bit like you're an imposter at first. Sometimes what I say is what you're doing is really developing your own teaching persona. And so I've seen that there's a list of some ways of how you develop a teaching persona, including things like share a little bit of your personal life, not too much, but just a little bit. Ask yourself, what would you want if you were a student? Take some time to think about your own teaching philosophy, think about role models, be humorous if that fits your style, et cetera, et cetera. But developing your teaching style, if you've never taught before, it takes some time and it takes some effort, and it does feel like you're developing a different side of you. So what we're going to do now is also think of a teacher you had or have had that you admire. What are the qualities of that teacher? And can you imagine yourself teaching in that style? So again, think for a minute or two. This will also be in our discussion this week, and then we'll turn back on the video when you're done. Okay, let's come back for, I think this is our final thing for today. I keep saying that, but So developing a teaching style, how would you rate yourself and your natural personality? So this is a fun little activity. So you could go ahead again and pause this and just kind of look through this. And are you more shy, or are you more gregarious? Are you more formal? Are you more informal? How do you fit in on this paradigm, and kind of think through that a little bit? So again, take a minute, pause, look through that, see where you fit in. Okay, and now we're back. So, I think it's interesting to analyze yourself, but sometimes we think that there should be one way to be, but that's not always the case. So, you have to find what's right for your teaching context, what's right for your own personality, and what fits in with your students. And sometimes that doesn't fit in with, certain expectations that students have as to what should the teacher roles be, especially cultural expectations. So, for example, on the left are some teacher role expectations. Teachers are expected to have all the answers, versus on the right, teachers are allowed to say, "I don't know." So, which one fits? Teachers and students are expected to suppress their emotions, maybe in some cultures, versus teachers and students are allowed to show emotion in the classroom. And so you can go down this list and you can kind of see. So it's not just that there's one way to be, but particularly if you end up teaching overseas, in a new culture, there may be different cultural expectations that are out there than what you feel most comfortable doing, or the role models that you've had in the past that you really liked that may not work in that situation. You might have to adapt. So the final discussion reflection, and this again will be in our discussion this week. What's your natural personality teaching style like? What are the cultural expectations, the teaching context you're anticipating, and how well do the two match? Are there some areas that you think might not work so well, that might not be such a good match, and you might have to think about a little bit as you become a teacher? So that's it for this week. I'm sure I've gone over my 20-minute limit, but oh well. There's a lot of information there. Hopefully it's good information, useful information, and I'm going to stop now so that I don't just babble on and on and on. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the online discussions. And now I got to turn this off somehow because I never can find that right button, but it's there somewhere. Stop, where to go? I know it's there. Stop.